In the introductory lecture to Purgatorio, I suggested that Dante's poetic work is valuable because it creates a concrete imaginary world to embody 4 deep medieval principles about the spiritual life. And we had time to talk about point number 1. That is, that purgatory is a place of radical humility, a radical openness to the gift of being. And the way souls are prepared to embrace this gift is to be brought to learn at the deep level of the heart that they're completely feeble without the assistance of God and without the assistance of their neighbor. With their weakness constantly fresh on their minds, then they are put almost for the first time in a position where they can appreciate that even their own power of choice is a gift. Paradoxically, their freedom is a gift. In this lecture, I want to continue by commenting on this idea, as well as how, too, purgatory is a place of surprising and abundant mercy. How purgatory is a place where the divisive community is healed through prayer, and then finally, how purgatory is a place where complacency is overcome. I'll focus on how these 4 principles are embodied in the drama, which unfolds from Canto 2 to Canto 9. That is, within that part of the island called anti-purgatory. That is, the place of waiting outside of the gates. Most of us have a desire to look at the world in a way which we call practical, by which we most often mean to see the world in light of that shrewd, sad, melancholic spirit with which we read the newspapers about whatever new disaster has erupted within the world. We like to think of this understanding of what's really going on and the causes and effects of social problems as practical or realistic or informed. But in Dante's Purgatory, the souls have to be retrained to look at the world in light of supernatural virtues. That is, to see temporal events as constantly presenting an opportunity for the radical incursion of God's mercy. Indeed, one of the most beautiful things about Dante's Purgatorio is its depiction of how easy mercy is to come by, because he who offers it is so quick to pour it forth. It would be like if you were suffering from thirst in a desert and begged for a tiny bit of water squeezed from a medicine dropper and got a barrel dumped on you instead. Dante portrays this quite dramatically in the figure of Manfred, whom we meet in Canto 3. Manfred was the illegitimate son of Emperor Frederick II, whom we have already met among the heretics, seemingly because the emperor, in his struggle with the medieval papacy and in his machinations to wrest power from the church, had gone beyond politics to set himself up as an alternative to the church, thus creating a false dichotomy between the temporal and spiritual. Manfred continued his father's political campaign, moving ever farther north from Sicily and southern Italy in a slow attempt to reconquer the entirety of the Italian peninsula. But his advance was stopped by a papal and French force at the Battle of Benevento in the year 1266, the year after our poet was born. The important point for us to notice is that Manfred's inclusion among the saved would have shocked many of Dante's first readers, especially the papal-supporting Republican middle-class nouveau riche of Guelph, Florence. It would be a little bit like if you told Democrats that you had a vision of the afterlife and Bush and Trump were there in bliss, or if you included Obama and Hillary within a book intended for a Republican readership. Manfred? Dante's Florentine readers would have asked. The warmongering son of a heretic who was trying to divest the church of its property? Well, Dante makes Manfred admit that, quote, horrible were my sins. And he is here in anti-purgatory because he spent most of his life holding the church and its sacraments in contempt. In Dante's Purgatory, the rule is for every year you hold the church in contempt, that is, for every year you go thinking that you don't need the help of institutionalized religion, you have to wait 30 years in purgatory before you're even allowed in through the gates to begin cleansing yourself. But in any case, in the end, it is the case that this unlikely soul got into purgatory, seemingly at the absolute last second. As he says, after he was sliced by 2 deadly blows, wounds he still bears in purgatory, he had just enough blood in his body to turn, quote, in tears to him who freely pardons. But we should note another interesting little narrative detail. Manfred, when he introduces himself to Dante, does not describe himself describe himself as you would expect a medieval leader to do, that is, according to his father's line, as the son of a powerful emperor, Friedrich II, but rather he introduces himself as the grandson of Empress Constance, as if in seeking for his true spiritual inheritance, he had to go back to a female relative, a grandmother. In light of eternity, Manfred is forced to re-see his life and find that the inheritance he truly received was not what he would have reckoned important in his earthly life. Just 2 Canti later, we meet a couple of other souls who died violent deaths. This time, though, it was not so much that they held institutionalized religion in contempt, like Manfred, but rather they put off repenting, doing what they knew they needed to do until the absolute last second. One of these souls is named Buonconte da Montefeltro, that is, the son of Guido da Montefeltro, whom we met in Inferno 27, the false counselor turned Franciscan who went back to the game just one last time and thus sealed his own fate in hell. You'll remember that although the father Guido thought he was in the fold, a demon came to drag him down to hell at his death because he had not actually been repentant for his final evil deed. His son, Buonconte, too, continued in the ways of his father. He too was a good general. But in his final battle, fate caught up with him. He was wounded in the throat, and as he wandered across the field, barely able to speak, he had just enough breath to whisper, "Maria," before he fell to the ground. And so here we have a man of violence and blood who spent his whole life campaigning, delighting in the destruction of his enemies. You would think that for such a bloody life, a trip straight to hell would be within the order of justice. But in Purgatorio, as we've said, mercy is surprisingly abundant. You ask for a drop and get a shower. And so Dante depicts this minuscule act of true piety, Maria, as sufficient to win for this soul an eternity in bliss. And thus Buonconte's death plays out just the opposite his father's did. His father, Guido, confident that he had covered his bases, goes to hell. The son, even if only for a single instant, utters one sincere cry of confession of his need for help and will get in, ultimately, to heaven. Buonconte relates that when the demon came to claim his rightful property, that is Buonconte's soul, the dark angel was surprised and enraged to find that Buonconte would not be his. Rather, the soul of Buonconte is snatched up by God's angel. The demon, in disbelief and even contempt, asks the angel, "You carry off this man's eternal part for a little tear?" But the answer, of course, is yes. A little tear finds an ocean of mercy in reply. Thus, in Dante's Purgatory, you have to readjust your expectation of reality to see grace and mercy as just under the surface, under pressure, as it were, waiting to erupt into this world at the least possible sincere excuse. Or to put it in Manfred's words, the unlikely may happen so long as hope has a single fresh flower. All else in the field might be dead. But if just one tiny plant, just one little dandelion at the far corner of the field remains in bloom, all will be well. Purgatory, then, is the explosive place where your vision of the world is restored, where you come to see that God was very near, just under the surface throughout your life. But it is also a place where you have to be restored to a harmonious place within the human community. And this is my third point. You remember that souls in hell, in the pursuit of the goods of the world, were willing to break from the communion with the human community to get those things. They wanted their political office so bad that they're willing to cheat on the campaign laws, or wanted victory so bad on the battlefield that they're willing to use evil engines of war to destroy the gullible, such as Ulysses. But the souls in Purgatory, even if at the very last minute, sincerely renounce their desire to operate within this divisive system. And yet, they still have to be brought back into the human community. They still have to learn how to operate in a non-individualistic way, a task which is easier said than done. When you've spent your whole life strategically planning how to get ahead in your career, meditating on how to start a lucrative business despite the fact that it makes a worthless product, or calculating how you will win friends and manipulate people, then it's hard to submit your will to a group and truly love their good, because you spent your whole life doing the opposite. But in Dante's Purgatory, as we'll see, souls have to lean on one another for support and chant prayers in perfect harmony with those who surround them. They have to bend the bow back in the opposite direction of its warped curvature in life. This reintegration back into the human community is dramatized vividly also in Anti-Purgatory. Again, that section I have described as the antechamber of purgatory, where souls have to wait until those back on earth, the very souls they had meant to hoodwink in life, pray for them. My favorite example of this comes from a section we're not going to discuss today. A Sienese aristocrat, mentioned in Canto 13, confesses that she spent her whole life envying the success of those around her. And she too would have had to spend a lot of time in the pre-purgatorial realm of waiting. But, she explains, because she too was a late repentant, but she found surprising and unsolicited help. I sought my peace with God at the very last, and penitence would not have reduced the debt had it not been for Peter the comb seller, who in his charity was grieved for me and remembered me in his devout petitions. Extraordinary lines. Unless Peter the comb seller, the equivalent of the immigrant street vendor, had not prayed for her. Thus, from the viewpoint of the afterlife, a man whom the well-off, moneyed, aristocratic Sapia would have had nothing but contempt for in life, becomes a soul with whom she now has a spiritual bond. Through his prayer for her, he has become someone she has spiritually to lean on. And so through such acts of human love, the human community, divisive on earth, is slowly knit back together. But let's go back to one of the Canti in Anti-Purgatory, this time Purgatorio 5. That whole canto, in fact, is devoted to souls asking the pilgrim to pray for them. Or as Dante puts it, he was like a guy who's just won the lottery, and people are all around him, clapping him on the back and asking that he remember them. When they first know that he's still alive, they almost trample one another to get to him. Dante says, "Never have I seen falling stars streak across the placid sky, nor at nightfall, lightning pulse within the clouds of August, as swiftly as these two messengers ran upward, and when they reached the others, they all, like an unruly band, turned and charged toward us. The laws of the place dictate that you either have to wait the allotted time which counterbalances your delayed repentance, or you have to have your time of waiting lessened on account of being the beneficiary of the sincere prayers of those on earth. Thus in purgatory, the fact that souls can have mercy won for them helps condition them to love the human community again, because they are now dependent on its members." And finally, purgatory is a place of desire, a place where complacency must be overcome. If you're like me, you like to show up 5 to 10 minutes before an appointment. And if you're like me, you start to get a little anxious and nervous as the time of the meeting approaches. More nervous when the person you're waiting for is 5 minutes late, and completely frustrated by 10 or 15 minutes after the appointed time. Now here in Anti-Purgatory in particular, those lackadaisical souls who stood up God in life have to wait. To feel the time tick by. To grow impatient and frustrated and almost beside themselves with desire, until there's such an overwhelming desire to just get this show on the road that they're ready to begin. One of Dante's most beloved authors, Richard of St. Victor, said desire, what he even called a violent desire, plays a crucial role in the spiritual life, because God doesn't give us what we don't want. And thus a holy desire, a burning, passionate desire, is a prerequisite for the spiritual life. Similarly, in Canto 2, we hear old Cato upbraid the souls for standing around. He shouts at them in fury, "Correte al monte!" Run, you sluggish souls, toward the mountain. Similarly, the necessity of this desire is illustrated in the pilgrim's arduous climb. For example, in Canto 4, the pilgrim's so tired from climbing the mountain that he's falling behind. Quote, "Exhausted, I complained. Beloved Father, turn around and see how I'll be left alone unless you pause." "My son," he said, "drag yourself up there," pointing to a ledge a little higher. His words so spurred me on, I forced myself to clamber up. It's at this point that Dante and Virgil see the lazy soul of Belacqua resting in the shade. Dante points him out to Virgil. "Oh, my dear Lord," I said, "just look at him. He shows himself more indolent than if sloth had been his very sister." Then he turned his eyes and fixed his eyes on us, barely lifting his face above his haunch, and said, "Go on up, then, you who are so spry." It's then that Dante recognizes an old friend from Florence. Quote, "His lazy movements and curt speech slowly shaped my lips into a smile, and I began, 'Belacqua, no longer need I grieve for you. But tell me, what keeps you sitting here? Have you gone back to your old lazy ways?' And he, 'Brother, what's the good of going up? The angel of God who sits in the gateway would not let me pass into torments. I must wait outside as long as in my lifetime the heavens wheeled around me, while I put off my sighs of repentance to the end, unless I'm helped by prayers that rise from a heart that lives in grace.'" Belacqua is a delightful character. He's your easygoing, relaxed friend who's always telling you to chill out a bit. But at the same time, it becomes clear that Belacqua will be here a long time. He has not yet felt that holy impatience, that keen desire to get his soul ready to see God. For the most part, this brings us to a close of my description of the four principles which form the bedrock of the imaginary world of the second canticle, Purgatorio. But there's one more group of souls waiting outside the gates which we have to talk about. These are the failed kings who dwell in that beautiful valley whose description I read in the previous lecture. At the end of Purgatorio 6, Dante and Virgil come upon another man who does not seem too eager to speak to them. We will later learn that this is the medieval poet Sordello, who lived in northern Italy and Lombardy. Virgil approaches him to ask him for directions, and Sordello asks for his story. Virgil can only get out one word, Mantua, before this lazy soul, unlike Belacqua down below, bolts to his feet, leaps toward him, and says, "O Mantuan, I am Sordello of your city." And the two of them embraced. Although separated by 1,000 years, they were from the same region of Italy, a place they both loved, and thus feel a connection. Dante praises this joyful, effortless brotherly love, something akin to if you're abroad and you hear an American accent. Instantly, the two of you bond. Two people from the same place wandering in a foreign land. You say, "What? You're from Nebraska? Well, I'm from Pennsylvania." And then you feel like fast friends and buy one another a drink. But Dante uses this brief fraternal exchange as a contrast for the crooked, fragmented, and vicious state of his Italy. It's a contrast he will hammer home like a blacksmith furiously beating an anvil over the next 75 lines. He abuses, denounces, and decries Italy. He calls Italy a slave, a house of misery, an unkept and overgrown garden, a ship in a storm without a pilot, a harlot. He likens Italy to a sick person who's so miserable that he keeps turning over in bed because every position he rests in hurts. Dante says Italy is continually at war. Her people continually gnaw on one another. Italy, he adds, is like an unbridled horse with a thrown rider. Dante laments that Italy is a democracy out of control. Her rightful ruler, the Holy Roman Emperor, is north of the Alps. The king has abandoned the garden of Europe. And without his presence, Rome is a widow. But worse, every man sees his neighbor not as a brother, but as a competitor. Rather than living as a household under a father, they live in a vicious, boiling world in which each eyes the other as a commercial rival, as a pawn to be used, or as a consumer to be fed lies. "Ah, Italy enslaved," he cries, "abode of misery. How eager was that noble soul, only at the sweet name of his city, to welcome there his fellow citizen. Search, you wretch, around your shores, then look into your heart, if any part of you rejoice in peace." Dante, you can see, clearly believes in what he calls zello, zeal. Later in Canto 8, one of the penitent souls will decry the unfaithful heart of his wife with great passion, which Dante describes in this way. He spoke these words, his face stamped with a look of righteous indignation that burns with proper measure in the heart. Thus Dante decries Italy, denounces her, like one of his characters will later denounce his unchaste spouse. The heat of his rhetoric is scorching. The poet lets himself go with a venom which has shocked modern readers, although the poet would have said that his anger was righteous. But once the fiery Dante has calmed himself down a bit, taken a deep breath, he continues with his narrative. Sordello is doubly delighted to learn that the man standing before him is not just a countryman, but a celebrity, Virgil, the greatest poet of ancient Rome, whom Sordello calls, "O glory of the Latins, through whom our language showed what it could do. O eternal honor to the town where I was born." But interestingly, Sordello, a minor poet, of vastly inferior talent to Virgil, will become the instructor of the great Roman in a moment which goes to show how Virgil is increasingly out of place in the midst of this Christian world of humility. Virgil notes that it's getting late and he wants to get some more miles in. At this point, Sordello shocks the ancient poet, informing him that here no one can climb at night. "How is that?" asked Virgil. "If a man should wish to climb by night, would he be hindered? Or would he not ascend because he lacked the power?" Virgil, the self-reliant figure of virtue and discipline, can't imagine why you might not want to get a bit of work done in the evening as well. And this is the response he gets. Good Sordello drew his finger through the dust and said, "See, you would not cross even this line once the sun goes down. For nothing hinders the ascent except the darkness of the night, which binds the will with helplessness." To that, Virgil is described as quasi ammirando, as if in bewildered amazement. And purgatory, then, built into the very laws of the place, is a reinforcement of the lesson of your powerlessness. If the light is not shining, if you're not taking in the warmth and guidance of the sun, you can't even bumble along in the dark. Your very legs and arms go slack. In this extraordinary way, the souls of purgatory are reminded that what we often take for granted, our own health, our own intelligence, our own strength, even our own power of choice, is something we have very little control over. It exists as a radical gift from another. Again, as we have said, humility is openness to the radical gift of another. This is the brilliance of Dante's Purgatorio, because he gets at both of these truths at once. On the one hand, souls have to recognize their own powerlessness, but on the other, we have just read about how the pilgrim huffing and puffing as his coach yells at him to get up to the next ledge. Thus, purgatory is not a passive place at all, like some spiritual operating room where you go under the surgeon repairs you while you sleep. Rather, Dante has made a purgatory which demands absolute activity, tremendous expenditures of sweat and energy, while also realizing that the very power to be reformed lies outside of your soul. The image I like to use to help understand these fully active and fully passive qualities of Dante's Purgatory is to think of the story of Moses and the Israelites at battle. You remember the Bible says that as long as Moses held his arms aloft, the Israelites would win. But as soon as he dropped his arms, they would begin losing. On one level, Moses' uplifted arms contributed in no way to the fighting, but it was the necessary instrument to channel in the strength of God. In a similar way, I think Dante's Purgatory should be understood as this keen struggle and suffering which is painfully active, but at the same time the strength which leads to the victory still lies outside of the power of the one who struggles. But to return to the narrative, after the poet's acidic denunciation of the political situation in Italy, and after Virgil is politely corrected by Sordello, we enter into the beautiful and fertile valley, the so-called Valley of the Kings, where a group of medieval kings who spent most of their treasuries fighting one another now have a chance to dwell for a time in the same valley in peace, and where they're made to pray in unison. And here Dante begins to put forward an answer to the question, why are things so bad? Because our leaders are failures. Keep in mind that the children and grandchildren of these aristocrats and royalty were still alive in Dante's day. But the fiery Florentine who has now assumed the untiring voice of the prophet, pulls no punches. In fact, he mentions 9 flawed kings and princes, all of who died between 1274 and 1292. That is, the kings who reigned and fought when Dante was a boy. The pilgrim sees Emperor Rudolf of Austria, who fought a war to secure his throne, but entirely neglected Italy and thus lost the opportunity to spare Italy the divisive problems to come. There's King Ottokar, who, interestingly enough, was actually killed by Rudolf in battle. Thus, enemies are united in the peaceful valley. There's Philip the Bold, King of France. And then there's Pedro III, King of Aragon, and Charles I of Anjou, who in life were also enemies, fighting over succession to the Sicilian throne. But beyond the obvious that these kings wasted their treasuries in quarreling over borders, Dante gives us another clue as to what they must now make up for. It's what I want to call Dante's analysis of the trust fund phenomenon. In verses 121 to 23. Rarely does human worth rise through the branches, and this he wills who gives it, so that it shall be sought from him. In other words, in medieval Europe, of course, nobility was defined in hereditary terms. Power, wealth, and titles passed down from father to son. But the concepts of nobility and greatness are things which interested Dante his whole life, in part because he was from a minor noble family, in part because he was a Florentine, and in part because of his philosophy of love. Dante emphasized throughout his whole life that nobility, in all that that term means, gentleness of blood, greatness of heart, expansiveness of vision, was the property of those, not of the trust fund class, but those with noble hearts. That is to say, those inspired by a vision of love, such as, for example, love poets. The danger of the aristocracy or royalty, Dante will point out again and again, is that they're in danger of the trust fund phenomenon. That is, they don't have noble hearts to match their noble lineage. To borrow an image from Dante himself, the children of royalty hang like rotting fruit on the withering branches of the family tree, because the heirs do not seek the nobility of the heart of their fathers. For all this, as we see in Canto 8, Dante's kings have to undergo a very peculiar exercise. That is, even before they get admitted to purgatory proper to work on their own personal vices, they have to atone for abusing their positions of wealth and their neglect of political office. They have to make up for the fact that they neglected their chief office of bringing order to their lands. Toward nightfall, every evening, they turn to face the east and sing, in monophonic chant, the Te Lucis.
Te lucis ante terminum, rerum creatur poscimus, ut pro tua clementia, sis presulet custodia. Procurre cerent somnia, et glossium phantasmata, ostemque nostrum comprime, ne polluantur corpora.
Then they all turn pale in nervous anticipation, because each night a serpent comes silently into this garden from some unexpected direction. Sordello explains to Dante that 2 angels each night come from the bosom of Mary to guard the valley from the serpent that will soon appear. This comes as startling news to the pilgrim. Not knowing by what path, I turned around all chilled with fear and huddled closer to the trusted shoulders. The serpent then slips into this garden, but soon after this, while the kings are praying, it's chased off by the angels with the swords. Strange. Every night, these failed kings have to endure, even participate in, this fascinating performance. Like if you went to a play and the actors leave the stage and mingle with the audience. I always hate those moments, afraid that I'll be caught up in the drama. But I've said before that purgatory is the place where your vision is readjusted to think about your own natural duties and virtues within the larger context of supernatural reality. Such failed kings, who took up their inherited duties but without that true nobility of heart, just a refined pedigree of ancestors, the spiritual trust fund babies, were not alert, vigilant to the constant and insidious threat, the perennial threat of the serpent slinking back into the garden. They ought to have been vigilant for their people, vigilant over their households, vigilant over their hearts. But they took up their office and their wealth as if they were their possessions to dispose as they wished. But here in purgatory, they have to get used to thinking about their vulnerability and their fragility, their need to stand in spiritual vigilance to have the assistance of God. After the play is described in the Valley of the Kings, we have a major transitional moment in which the poet narrates how the pilgrim goes from anti-purgatory to the gate of purgatory proper. And in this section, the poet sums up all the themes we identified in the first lecture. In Canto 8, the pilgrim has the first of 3 dreams. In fact, he'll spend 3 nights in purgatory. And on each one of those occasions, in the early morning hours, right before you wake up, when the medievals thought dreams were the truest, he'll have a dream which both predicts something true about his journey, but also hints at something deeper. If you think about it, using the dream as a way to talk about spiritual reality is a powerful poetic strategy, because it ensures that ultimate realities are left veiled, treated as nothing less than absolutely mysterious. For example, in Canto 8, Dante has a dream that he, like the mythological figure Ganymede, was snatched up by an eagle and flown to Olympus. But he's carried up into the sky so high that he's drawn through the atmosphere of air and then through that band of fire which was thought to surround the layer of air about the earth. On the most simple level, as Virgil explains, Dante has this dream because St. Lucy came down from heaven, took him up in her arms, and carried him to the entryway of purgatory. He has then a dream response to a real physical event in his life, like the sick child who, while dozing on the couch, dreams that she's being called to a banquet, just as a sibling is calling her to lunch. St. Lucy's intervention reinforces a point I made in this lecture, though, that purgatory is both fully passive and fully active. The pilgrim has to make the strenuous climb with his own feet, true. But at the same time, he can't accomplish it alone. He has to have divine assistance to get him over some insurmountable obstacles. Divine assistance to reach those deepest places we see just out of the corner of our eyes in dreams. But at the same time, this mysterious little dream foreshadows the end of Purgatorio, where Dante, now cleansed and having shed all his heaviness, will begin to rise up toward the heavens and pass into the heavenly sphere. But the pilgrim has no idea that this is in store for him. In this sense, the dream accomplishes a double function, both relating mysteriously what's actually taking place, but also prophesying a deeper reality, Dante's ascent to heaven. The dream then sublimates in some mysterious way the innermost desire of the heart. It's a longing for a reality which is above and beyond the heart's own ability to talk about it. And so it surfaces in the mysterious and symbolic enigmas of the dream. In Paradiso, though, Dante will step into the world he had dreamed about. Or rather, when he steps into the next world, he'll turn around and realize that everything he had experienced before was his insubstantial dreaming. This brings the pilgrim right up to the elaborate gate of purgatory. It has 3 great steps made of expensive stones, white, dark purple, and blood red. The gate's guarded by an angel whose face, like the others, is too bright for mortal eyes to look upon. The angel says that Peter has entrusted the keys of the place to him. But he also says that Peter's instructions to him were, err on the side of mercy. If any were to cast himself down at his feet in humble supplication, then I should admit him. I've always enjoyed this narrative detail, in part because, as we have said, one of the tasks of purgatory is developing the ability to see the world as abundantly merciful. And in part because I think it enables us to see how blind Belacqua is to the true nature of this place. You remember old Belacqua asking the pilgrim rather dejectedly, "What's the point of climbing?" But from this vantage, we realize that if his desire were greater, if he struck out, despite the ordinary customs of the place, threw himself down at the feet of the angel and begged admittance, then his desire would find its fulfillment. Because Peter's instructions were, quote, to err in opening rather than in keeping locked, if but the soul fall prostrate at my feet. Belacqua's desire, then, was the only thing really regulating his ascent, if he but requested a drop of water. You could say, then, that Purgatorio dramatizes a verse from the Epistle of James, who says in the 4th chapter, verse 3, "Ye fight and war, yet ye have not, because ye ask not." The angel also carves into Dante's brow with the tip of a sword 7 wounds, in the shape of the letter P. These wounds are externalizations of the wounds he bears within, and so paradoxically, the pilgrim is wounded in order that he be healed. Paradoxically, pain and suffering will be the medicine for those wounds which have now been forced into the open. Purgatorio is a place of frightening honesty, where you can no longer hide what you'd rather keep within. After passing through the grand gate of purgatory, Virgil and the pilgrim have to squeeze their way through a narrow rocky pass, a fascinating depiction of the narrow gate which leads to salvation. We were climbing through a crevice in the rock, which first bent one way, then another, like a wave that ebbs and then comes rushing back, and so hindered our slow steps. The waning moon had gained its bed, and sunk into its rest before we issued from that needle's eye. It's only then, after all these preliminary tests of the penitent's desire, his climbing of the lower half of the mountain, his colloquy with the stern angel, his strict warning not to look back as the gates closed, his arduous struggle through the rocky and lengthy crevice he can barely get skinny enough to slip through, only then that he's ready to begin to witness the suffering of the souls on the mountain and to climb the mountain himself. The pilgrim has passed the test of desire. He's ready to begin his own cleansing.